The night my great-grandfather's barn burned down, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. By the time I arrived, the flames had already eaten through 70 years of history. The oak beams he'd carved by hand were nothing but glowing bones under the collapsing roof. Diesel smoke hung low over the fields, thick enough to taste. The heat pushed back against the dawn, and even the dew on the cornstalks hissed like it wanted to escape. Standing there in the half-light, my boots sinking into the charred mud, I felt a strange stillness, not grief yet, not anger, just the raw understanding that something sacred had been violated. My great-grandfather, Seamus Brennan, built that barn in 1952 after coming home from World War II with a limp in his leg and a Purple Heart in his pocket. Every board, every nail, was a promise that his family would always have a place to stand. That promise was now a pile of ash. At first, I wanted to believe it was an accident. A spark from an old wire. A lightning strike, maybe. But the sheriff's deputy found the melted remains of a diesel can near the foundation. The fire marshal's report confirmed what my nose already knew: this was arson. Someone had torched a veteran's legacy, and they hadn't even bothered to hide it well. Word travels fast in small towns. By sunrise, 3 neighbors had already whispered the same name: Brenda Kilpatrick, president of the Millfield Estates Homeowners Association, the self-appointed guardian of property values and suburban perfection. She'd been grumbling for months that my agricultural structure didn't fit the look of her community, even though my land sat outside her HOA's jurisdiction entirely. To most people, Brenda was just another well-dressed realtor with a designer smile and a clipboard glued to her hand. To me, she was a walking reminder that power attracts the kind of people who can't handle being told no. I'd spent 27 years on the federal bench, watching that kind of arrogance destroy lives. I could spot it a mile away. That morning, as I sifted through the wreckage, I caught sight of something silver half buried in the soot: my grandfather's flagpole bracket. The brass plate was blackened, but the engraving was still clear: for service above self. I remember thinking, Brenda just made the worst mistake of her life. Because here's what she didn't know: when I retired from the federal judiciary, I didn't retire from justice. You can take the gavel out of a judge's hand, but you can't take the habit of seeing through lies. I'd spent my career dismantling networks of crooked officials who thought they were untouchable. Now, I was staring at the ashes of my family's past, realizing I was looking at the start of another one. I walked the perimeter of the barn's foundation, each step stirring a cloud of gray dust. The scent of burned corn and oil clung to everything: my clothes, my hair, my memory. The only sound was the slow crackle of cooling timber. And in that silence, I made myself a promise. I would find out exactly who lit that match, and I would make them regret it. By the time the sun broke over the horizon, the fire trucks had left, the sheriff had shrugged his way through the paperwork, and the neighbors had retreated to their neat cul-de-sacs. I stayed, watching smoke drift into the sky like a signal flare. I realized something deeper was burning beneath the surface, a corruption that reached far beyond one petty HO, a dispute. Brenda thought she was getting rid of an eyesore. What she really did was declare war on a man who'd spent his life exposing people like her. She assumed retired judge meant harmless old man. She didn't realize I'd sent entire county commissions to prison for abusing the very power she was now wielding. So I picked up that charred flagpole bracket, wiped the soot from the engraving, and drove the remaining pole back into the ground where the barn had stood. It leaned slightly, blackened and battered, but still upright. Just like the Brennan name. That was the morning the war began, not just between me and Brenda Kilpatrick, but between every homeowner who's ever been bullied by a self-appointed tyrant, and the belief that ordinary people can still fight back. If the devil ever needed a real estate agent, her name would be Brenda Kilpatrick. Brenda didn't just run the Millfield Estates Homeowners Association, she ruled it. To the untrained eye, she looked like any suburban success story, a sharp bob haircut, perfect manicure, and a Mercedes that gleamed like polished bone. But beneath that professional polish was the soul of a warlord disguised in silk. She was 5'6" of weaponized confidence, always dressed like she was late to a board meeting in hell. Her suits were cream, her heels were lethal, and her smile had the kind of precision that comes from years of using it as a weapon. When those stiletto heels clicked against the pavement, you could practically hear a countdown begin. Tick, tick, tick. Something or someone was about to get fined. Brenda's kingdom stretched across 847 houses of suburban sameness, identical facades, identical lawns, identical lives. She'd turned conformity into an art form. The Millfield Estates HOA wasn't about community, it was about control. And control was Brenda's favorite currency. Her rise to local power wasn't an accident. Brenda was a strategist. She married Randy Kilpatrick, the county's most well-connected construction contractor. Between her real estate sales and his development company, they owned more influence than most elected officials. Permits, contracts, zoning favors, all of it passed quietly through the Kilpatrick network. Every McMansion they sold tightened the noose around the people who lived inside them. Neighbors whispered stories, late-night emails, demanding homeowners repaint their doors because the shade of navy didn't align with community standards. $150 fines for leaving garbage bins visible for more than 9 minutes past pickup time, and letters warning that unsightly holiday inflatables diminish neighborhood prestige. And yet, to outsiders, Brenda was the very picture of civic dedication. She hosted HOA meetings in the local church basement, complete with catered cheese platters and PowerPoint slides full of smiling families. She used words like community values, shared vision, and neighborhood pride. What she really meant was obedience. Her charm wasn't warm, it was tactical. She flattered local reporters, sponsored the county's charity golf tournament, and personally handed out scholarship checks at the high school. It was all part of the show. The benevolent queen keeping up appearances while quietly amassing control behind the scenes. When she first heard a retired federal judge had bought land adjacent to her pristine subdivision, she must have seen it as an opportunity, a chance to bring a prestigious name under her thumb. She sent polite letters about community harmony and cooperative beautification. I ignored them. Then came the second wave. Reminder notices, friendly requests, and finally, mandatory compliance, each more demanding than the last. She thought I was just another old man who'd rather fold than fight. She didn't realize I'd spent my life dismantling people who used power like a cudgel. In her world, image was everything. A red barn, especially one with history, personality, and rust stains older than her HOA, was an eyesore she couldn't tolerate. She saw my property as an infection in her perfect picture. She called it non-conforming architecture. I called it home. But Brenda wasn't content to write nasty letters. She wanted to win. And when someone like Brenda wants something, she doesn't ask, she maneuvers. Her connections at the county office meant she could conjure code enforcement visits out of thin air. Her husband's firm had county projects up for bid, which gave her leverage over local officials who liked their paychecks fat and their consciences thin. She'd spent years fine-tuning the art of intimidation, one violation notice, one whispered threat at a time, until every homeowner in Millfield Estates learned the same lesson: resistance was expensive. The irony was almost poetic. Brenda believed she was expanding her empire. What she didn't realize was that she'd just picked a fight with the one man in Iowa who'd made a career out of dismantling empires. If Brenda's HOA was a castle built on fear, then my old corn barn was the crack in its foundation. She wanted it gone because it reminded her of something she couldn't control: authenticity. The kind of stubborn, unbending truth that doesn't need permission to exist. And so, as the ashes of my barn cooled and the smell of burned oak still clung to the air, I finally understood who I was up against. Brenda Kilpatrick didn't just want to erase a building, she wanted to erase me. But I'd seen tyrants before, both in pinstripes and prison jumpsuits. They all had one thing in common: they believed their power made them untouchable. And I'd made a career proving people like that wrong. To most people, a barn is just a building: wood, nails, and dust. But to my family, that old red barn was a living thing. It had a heartbeat, steady and patient, that pulsed through generations. Every scuff on the floorboards, every rusted hinge, every patch of faded paint told a story that no photograph could capture. My great-grandfather built it after returning from Europe in 1946. He'd survived artillery fire, trench winters, and the kind of loneliness that leaves a scar no metal can cover. When he came home, he didn't talk much about the war. Instead, he built. Hammer by hammer, he rebuilt a sense of peace that the world had taken from him. The barn was his therapy, his declaration that creation could still triumph over destruction. Inside its walls, my grandfather stored the corn that paid our bills, the hay that fed our cattle, and the tools that shaped our livelihood. My father learned to walk on those dirt floors. I learned to drive my first tractor there. And when my son came home from his first tour overseas, that's where he stood for the family photo, the three of us, side by side, framed by sunlight, spilling through slats my great-grandfather's hands had nailed. That barn wasn't just timber. It was a timeline, a monument to work, sweat, and sacrifice, all the things that built rural America long before manicured lawns and HOA bylaws replaced dirt roads and handshake promises. When I saw its remains smoldering, something primal twisted inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was mourning. Brenda hadn't torched a structure she'd desecrated, an heirloom, a symbol of endurance that outlasted 4 wars and a century of storms. You see, legacy isn't about money or monuments. It's about continuity. It's the way a smell, a place, or a sound can tie a person to generations they've never met. My barn carried that connection, the echo of hammers from the 1940s, the laughter of cousins in the rafters, the smell of oil and grain blending with the seasons. And now all that was gone. But here's the thing about people like my great-grandfather, and I suppose about people like me. We don't stay broken. We rebuild. We take what's left and start again, not because it's easy, but because it's sacred. That's when I knew this fight wasn't just about property. It was about history, about every family that's ever been told by people like Brenda that progress means erasing what came before. So when I stood in those ashes, I wasn't just looking at loss. I was looking at a challenge, one written in smoke and memory, daring me to protect what mattered. And I decided right then, if Brenda Kilpatrick wanted a war over what my family stood for, she was going to get one. If you've ever lived under the shadow of an HOA, you already know they don't need a badge to act like law enforcement. They fine you for your mailbox being the wrong shade of white. They threaten lions over a cracked driveway. They micromanage lives under the banner of community standards. But what most homeowners don't realize, and what Brenda Kilpatrick definitely didn't realize, is that HOAs only have the power you let them have. When I first joined the federal bench, I learned that power always hides behind procedure. Bureaucrats, boards, committees, they all thrive on one thing: intimidation through paperwork. People surrender not because they're wrong, but because they get exhausted fighting back. Brenda had built her little empire on that very principle. She weaponized bylaws like they were bullets, firing off letters filled with phrases like violation of covenant, 4B, and failure to comply with community design code. But here's the catch: none of that applied to me. My property sat outside Millfield Estates. No shared deed, no easements, no recorded covenant. I wasn't bound by her HOA at all. Legally, Brenda's authority stopped exactly where my fence began. Yet, she sent letters, notices, and even code enforcement officers to inspect my barn. It was a deliberate overreach, a strategy to assert control where none existed. That's how tyranny begins, not with force, but with paperwork dressed as law. So I started digging. Old habits die hard. I pulled county property records, zoning maps, and incorporation documents. I found exactly what I expected. Brenda had been blurring jurisdiction lines for years. Several homeowners on the edge of Millfield had been bullied into compliance, fined for violations that weren't enforceable. Most just paid up to make the harassment stop. I didn't. I'd spent 3 decades dissecting corrupt bureaucracies, and Brenda's HO looked like a miniature version of every one of them. Layers of procedure designed to confuse, letters written to sound official but built on sand. It was intimidation theater. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. The HOA's budget showed unexplained consulting fees paid to Kilpatrick Development Group, her husband's company. Meeting minutes mysteriously excluded any discussion of those payments. When residents questioned them, Brenda dismissed it as routine contracting. Routine. That word always means cover-up. And here's the irony. HOAs were originally designed to protect property values, not to create fiefdoms. Their authority comes from one thing: the covenants homeowners agree to when they buy their property. Those contracts are enforceable, but only within their legal boundaries. When an HOA president crosses that line, it's not enforcement anymore. It's harassment. I drafted a letter, not a rant, not a threat. A legal statement. Precise, surgical, cold as marble. I cited state statutes, property boundary filings, and HOA charter language. I made it clear that her inspections constituted trespass, her notices were unlawful, and any further interference would be treated as civil harassment. Then I sent copies to Brenda, to the HOA board, to the county attorney, and most importantly, to the local press. The next morning, Brenda called me personally. Her tone was honey dipped in acid. "Judge Brennan," she said, "surely there's been some misunderstanding." I told her there wasn't. I told her that if her organization continued to harass property owners outside its jurisdiction, I'd file an injunction faster than she could schedule her next meeting. She went silent. That was the first time, I think, that Brenda realized she wasn't dealing with a retiree in overalls. She was dealing with someone who'd spent his career dismantling systems just like hers, only bigger, meaner, and better funded. But power doesn't surrender easily. When you threaten someone's illusion of control, they double down. Brenda did what bullies always do. She tried to get even. What she didn't know was that she'd already stepped into a trap of her own, making a legal snare built out of arrogance, paper, and fire. Corruption rarely hides in shadows. It hides in plain sight, smiling, shaking hands, cutting ribbons at charity events. Brenda Kilpatrick understood that better than anyone. Her real gift wasn't leadership, it was camouflage. If you'd asked anyone in Millfield Estates about Brenda, they'd tell you she was a pillar of the community. She donated to the fire department, hosted barbecues for the police union, and chaired the local Rotary Club. She was everywhere, shaking hands at county fairs, sponsoring Little League teams, delivering speeches about the pride of Millfield. But every ribbon she cut, every photo she posed for, bought her one more ounce of protection. I'd seen the same pattern in politics, in corporations, even in the judiciary. Build a wall of goodwill high enough, and you can bury a mountain of wrongdoing behind it. It didn't take long for me to uncover the scaffolding behind Brenda's empire. Her husband Randy's company, Kilpatrick Development Group, was listed as a contractor for multiple community improvement projects. On paper, they were legitimate landscaping upgrades, drainage repairs, sign replacements. But the invoices told another story: inflated costs, missing receipts, and suspicious consulting charges that lined up perfectly with HOA dues increases. It wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was self-dealing Brenda approving contracts that directly benefited her household. A blatant conflict of interest under state law. But in small towns, legality is often a matter of confidence. If you act like you're in charge long enough, people stop questioning whether you actually are. I called a few contacts, former colleagues, attorneys, an investigator I'd trusted for years. We pieced together a trail of money that wound from the HOA's budget to Randy's shell companies, then back into political donations for a county supervisor's re-election campaign. That supervisor just happened to oversee zoning approvals for Kilpatrick Development Group. It was a perfect circle. Brenda controlled the HOA dues, Randy funneled them through contracts, and their political allies made sure no one looked too closely. Everyone profited except the homeowners footing the bill. I started meeting with residents, one by one. A retired teacher fined for hanging a flower basket without approval. A veteran whose front porch light violated aesthetic standards. A young couple threatened with foreclosure over unpaid maintenance assessments they didn't even owe. Every story sounded the same: intimidation wrapped in bureaucracy. When I asked if they'd ever seen detailed financial statements, they laughed bitterly. Brenda only released summaries. The fine print, she said, was confidential. That word again, confidential. I'd heard it used by every crooked official who ever tried to hide behind a locked filing cabinet. So I filed a public records request with the county clerk's office, asking for every permit, variance, and contract associated with Kilpatrick Development Group and the HOA. Within 48 hours, my phone rang. It wasn't the clerk, it was Brenda. "Judge Brennan," she said, voice sharp as broken glass, "these kinds of requests create unnecessary tension in our community." "Tension," I replied, "is what happens when the truth gets close to the surface." There was a pause, then she dropped the pretense. "You're making a mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." She was right, I didn't know yet, but she just confirmed what I suspected. There was more to her power than homeowner dues and board meetings. The next day, I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox. Inside were photocopies of invoices, payments from the HOA to a consulting firm that didn't exist, signed by Brenda herself. No return address. No note. Just evidence, plain and cold. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a petty neighborhood feud. It was organized manipulation, fueled by greed and protected by fear. Brenda's reach extended into county offices, contractors, even local media outlets that relied on her advertising dollars. She wasn't running an HOA. She was running a machine. And like all machines built on exploitation, it couldn't handle scrutiny. All it needed was the right pressure point: one document, one hearing, one story told loud enough to make the whole thing collapse. I didn't burn her barn. She burned mine. But now, I was about to light something else, a fire made of truth and evidence. The kind that doesn't destroy homes, it destroys reputations. The Kilpatricks had built their fortune on silence. I was going to break that silence, one file, one headline, one courtroom motion at a time. Because when corruption hides in plain sight, the only way to fight it is to drag it into daylight. Every takedown starts the same way. You don't attack the fortress, you find the crack in the wall. Brenda Kilpatrick had spent years building her fortress out of money, influence, and intimidation. But every empire built on fear forgets one truth: fear only works until someone stops being afraid. By the time I'd gathered enough evidence to fill a banker's box, the cracks were showing. Anonymous letters slipped under my door. Neighbors whispering in parking lots instead of speaking openly. The facade of community harmony was splintering under the weight of her lies. The first step was simple: exposure. You can't win against power in the dark. You drag it into the light, and you let it melt. I met with Marcus Rodriguez and a half-dozen other homeowners in my barn, what was left of it anyway. The roof beams were blackened and bowed, the smell of smoke still clinging to the timber. But the air that night was electric. We sat around an old work table, the FBI's evidence photos spread out like tarot cards foretelling someone's downfall. "Brenda's got the county," Marcus said. "The construction board, the real estate folks, even the damn newspaper." "Then we take her where she can't buy the outcome," I replied. "Federal court." That was the beauty of the law. State corruption collapses when federal jurisdiction steps in. And I had enough to justify it: collusion, racketeering, conspiracy under color of law, violation of property rights, retaliation, and civil rights abuse. Michael Chen, my former clerk, turned Chicago Bulldog attorney, arrived 2 days later in a rented sedan filled with legal folders. He walked into my kitchen, took one look at the evidence, and grinned like a man who'd just been handed a career-defining case. "Judge," he said, "this isn't just harassment. This is systemic extortion dressed in HOA paperwork." He filed motions like artillery fire, one after another. Federal subpoenas went out to the county clerk, the utilities department, and Kilpatrick Development Group's bank. Every subpoena was a detonation, shaking loose years of buried transactions. And that's when the real panic began. Brenda's allies started turning on each other. The county code officer, Dale Hoffman, who'd once stood shaking in my driveway, came forward voluntarily. He handed over internal emails showing that Brenda had orchestrated the entire complaint campaign against me. "I can't do this anymore," he said, eyes hollow. "They made me sign off on violations that didn't exist." His confession was the first domino. Then came an anonymous thumb drive dropped in the night mail slot of my office containing HOA board meeting recordings. In them, Brenda bragged about removing undesirable properties and reclaiming underused land for redevelopment. Her tone wasn't administrative, it was imperial. Each revelation fueled the fire. The local paper, long her mouthpiece, suddenly found its courage once the FBI confirmed an ongoing investigation. The next Sunday's front page headline read, "Federal probe targets Millfield Estates, HOA president in land fraud case." The photo beneath it captured Brenda leaving her office, face frozen mid-scowl, sunglasses hiding everything but guilt. When the article hit, the neighborhood exploded. Homeowners who'd been silent for years started talking. They formed committees, demanded audits, filed their own lawsuits. The Kilpatrick's fortress was crumbling, not from outside assault, but from the people inside, finally realizing they'd been prisoners. Then came the moment that flipped the balance completely. Federal agents executed search warrants on Kilpatrick Development Group's offices and the HOA headquarters. They found falsified accounting records, hidden payments to county officials, and correspondence proving Brenda had ordered the barn fire as part of an intimidation campaign. Her own vanity had betrayed her. The emails were signed BK, complete with her signature emoji. When I got the call from Agent Kowalski, her tone carried the satisfaction of someone who'd just closed the trap on a predator. "Judge," she said, "we've got everything. Racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. We're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Expect subpoenas to start flying." For the first time since that September morning when the barn burned, I allowed myself a slow, steady breath. It wasn't relief, not yet. Justice isn't about emotion, it's about completion. And this case wasn't finished. Brenda still had resources, and desperate people with power are the most dangerous kind. But the tide had turned. The woman who once strutted through HOA meetings like a queen now had federal marshals sorting through her filing cabinets. The same clipboard she'd used as a weapon was now logged as evidence. In small towns, justice doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with silence, the kind that falls when people stop believing the tyrant's lies. Within days, for sale signs began popping up across Millfield estates. Not because people were fleeing, because they were free. They could finally live without fear of another violation notice or midnight power outage. I didn't rebuild the barn right away. I wanted it to stand there, blackened and broken, a monument to what happens when you let corruption smolder unchecked. And every morning, as I stood by those ashes, I reminded myself why I'd fought not for revenge, but for restoration. For the simple truth that no one, not an HOA president, not a county commissioner, not even a federal judge, is above the law. The empire Brenda built was collapsing, piece by piece. And I wasn't done yet. The day the case hit federal court, the sun rose cold and clean, the kind of morning that doesn't care about human pride or reputation. Justice doesn't warm you. It strips you bare. Inside the United States District Courthouse in Cedar Rapids, the air buzzed with quiet tension. Every reporter within 50 miles had shown up, cameras rolling, notebooks poised. Local farmers sat beside homeowners in business suits, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the woman who'd ruled their lives like a monarch to face something she couldn't manipulate: the law. Brenda Kilpatrick entered wearing a navy suit 2 shades darker than her mood. The confident posture she'd wielded in every HOA meeting was gone, replaced by a brittle stiffness like glass under pressure. Her lawyer, a corporate litigator from Des Moines, whispered to her constantly, but Brenda's eyes stayed fixed on the defense table. Across from her, Michael Chen arranged his case files with surgical precision. He didn't grandstand, he prepared. Every piece of evidence was a scalpel, and by the time he was finished, Brenda's empire would be dissected for the world to see. When the judge, not me, thank God, entered the courtroom, the room rose. The irony didn't escape me. For decades, I'd been the one wielding the gavel. Now, I was sitting in the witness section, just another citizen waiting for truth to find daylight. The prosecution opened with Agent Kowalski's report, a clinical breakdown of corruption, collusion, and coercion. She laid out the evidence with military efficiency: falsified permits, backdoor land deals, and financial kickbacks funneled through shell corporations linked to the Kilpatricks. Then came the recordings. The courtroom fell silent as Brenda's voice echoed from the speakers. "If we push him just hard enough, he'll crack. These old men care more about their legacy than their land." The jurors' expressions shifted one by one from neutrality to disgust. There's a universal moment in every corruption trial when arrogance transforms into self-destruction. Brenda had just crossed that line herself. Next came the testimony. Dale Hoffman took the stand first, hands shaking but voice steady. He described the pressure, the phone calls, the anonymous complaints, dictated word for word by Brenda herself. "She told me to make his life miserable until he sold," he said. "Said she'd make it worth my while." "Did she?" Michael asked. Dale hesitated, then nodded. "She got my daughter a scholarship through one of her companies." The courtroom murmured the kind of sound that isn't loud but carries the weight of judgment. Then it was my turn. When I took the stand, I didn't look at Brenda. I looked at the jury, 12 ordinary people who'd never been inside a federal courtroom before this day. "I spent 27 years on the bench," I began, "and I thought I'd seen every form of greed, every variation of power abuse. But this was personal. Michael guided me through the evidence, but I didn't need notes. Every moment, from the first click of Brenda's heels on my driveway to the night my power went out, was carved into memory." "Mr. Brennan," Michael said, leaning slightly forward, "when she burned your barn, what did that symbolize to you?" I paused, long enough for the silence to ache. It wasn't just wood and history. It was everything my grandfather built after fighting for this country. And she thought it was expendable because it didn't fit her view of perfection. That's not community, that's tyranny dressed as civility. Brenda shifted in her seat, jaw tight, but she didn't look up. The reporters scribbled furiously. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper amen. Over 3 days, Michael dismantled Brenda's defense piece by piece. He presented the financial records' secret accounts, inflated construction bids, bribes disguised as consulting fees. He showed photographs from the night of the fire, matched tire tracks to her Mercedes, and read aloud the email where she ordered permanent removal of the agricultural obstruction. By the time the defense presented their case, it was like trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. Brenda took the stand on day 4. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a misunderstood leader, a woman simply trying to maintain neighborhood quality. But cross-examination is where arrogance goes to die. Michael stood calm, his voice steady but surgical. "Mrs. Kilpatrick, did you authorize harassment of residents through fabricated complaints?" "Of course not," she said, smiling with that trademark realtor charm. He clicked his remote. The big screen lit up with one of the recorded board meetings. Brenda's voice filled the room again. "File every complaint you can. If they drown in paperwork, they'll move out faster." The color drained from her face. "Would you like me to repeat the question?" Michael asked, his tone razor-thin. Brenda didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was confession enough. When closing arguments arrived, Michael didn't grandstand. He simply said, "Ladies and gentlemen, power in America isn't supposed to come from fear. It comes from fairness. The moment we let someone like Brenda Kilpatrick weaponize authority, we lose the foundation our communities are built on. Today, you have the power to restore that foundation." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear and unanimous. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, arson, and civil rights violations. Brenda's composure cracked like thin glass. Her husband slumped in his seat, face pale. The judge looked down from the bench, and for a moment, I saw the reflection of my younger self in him. The weight of justice, heavy but clean. "Mrs. Kilpatrick," he said, "your actions represent the worst abuse of local power I have ever seen. You turned community into a weapon. For that, you will spend the next 25 years in federal custody." The gavel fell. Final, unforgiving. As marshals led her away, she glanced toward me not with hatred, but disbelief. Like she still couldn't comprehend that the empire she'd built on intimidation had been undone by a retired old man with a camera, a phone, and the truth. Justice didn't roar that day. It whispered. And everyone heard it.